Bishop Thomas Dowd, thank you for joining us on Common Home TV.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're based in Melbourne, and I guess we need to situate where the residential school system sits. Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which talked about and admitted a cultural genocide and a catastrophic assimilation policy. Can you speak to a little bit about Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how that fits into the residential school system?
Yeah, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission got started as a consequence of a class action lawsuit. There had been survivors of the residential schools who sued for damages essentially arising from their very negative experience. And interestingly, this was not simply, some sort of payout. There was a real desire to find a way to move forward. And so one of the conditions of that was the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which invited survivors and all Canadians, in fact, to participate in a process of discovering truth and walking on a path of reconciliation, exactly what the name sounds like. So this commission started after the whole legal process had concluded, and it held large gatherings across Canada in major cities, as well as hearing from all kinds of survivors from all across the nation, and produced a landmark report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Also, it's commonly called the TRC, just for short. And it not only did an expose of the past, but also had multiple calls to action for the future, and really addressed Canadian society, not just as a sort of a global whole, but different actors within Canadian society, levels of government and churches as well. And so you might say the challenge became, after the publication of the report, how to grapple with all of these various calls to action. Now, the report was not a governmental report. It wasn't a royal commission or a parliamentary commission or something like that. It really was driven by the experience of survivors themselves, but it was received by the government. And, as part of that, has become simply part of Canadian fabric now. It was fundamentally focused on residential schools, certainly as the presenting issue. However, when you look at residential schools, what the report, of course, talks about, you use the expression cultural genocide, which was raised in the report. So what it basically said is, this is not simply about a few schools that went rogue or something like that. This is about an explicit policy designed to assimilate an entire set of peoples, not a people, a whole set of peoples, Canada's First Nations, Canada's Indigenous peoples. And this goes way, way back. And so the report has to trace not only, or present not only the actual experience of the schools, but the historical origin and sort of some of the systemic elements that go behind it. And so that is why many of the calls to action, or many of the points that are raised, are not simply about a school system that doesn't exist anymore. It's about the consequences of that school system. For example, if you have kids taken away from their families at a very young age, and of course, they're in a school where they're told they should not speak their native tongue to each other. So you have kids who they're essentially in isolation, right? And they are forced to dress differently, eat differently, speak differently. What does that do when you live in that kind of context for months and years? Well, it's going to have an impact. We see the loss of language, for example, among Indigenous people. Not as many people are fluent native speakers as you might otherwise have. And so this is a consequence that goes down through the generations. And then, as I say, you can also trace it backwards in time, going back to colonial policies, and really, getting at the heart of what is the fundamental identity of a country like Canada, which is, I love my country, it's beautiful, but like Australia, before Europeans showed up. There were already people there, and so our countries need to grapple with what has the historical relationship been between Indigenous and settlers, and it's the fundamental and core question that flows from the residential school experience, which in some ways is it's a cause of current realities, but a symptom of even bigger ones.
Can you speak a little bit about the time frame for those who aren't aware of, like, sort of the ballpark of the beginning to the end of the residential school systems in Canada? Just to give us a little more context.
Yeah, I don't have those numbers
Yeah.
At the tip of my fingers. I know that in my diocese, we had 3 residential schools. For any listeners, the schools were funded by the government, usually underfunded. They were funded by the government, but very often turned over to the churches to actually do the operation. And so we had 3 schools within the territory of my diocese, as it stands today, the limits of the diocese today. 1 was run by the Anglican Church, and 2 were run by the Catholic Church. They were side by side. 1 was a boys' school, 1 was a girls' school. Now, when I say run by the church, it was these were religious orders that were doing the actual operation and teaching of the schools. So those would have begun late 19th century, and they closed, I believe 1 closed in 1958 and the other closed in 1962. The residential schools, the government took over the schools directly. So in other words, the religious communities were not involved starting in the mid to late 60s, but the schools themselves in many cases continued under strictly lay leadership, you might say. And I think the last school closed in the 1990s. So you certainly have a legacy of up to 100 years, although it will be variable depending upon what part of the country you're talking about.
It brings us up to the apology. The apology the Catholic Church made officially happened in April. Well, the Pope is here now making it an in-person apology. We seem to be the last to do so. You mentioned that it wasn't just the Catholic Church involved in this. This was a colonial policy of the Canadian government. What took us so long to apologize?
It's a good question. Part of the complexity of the answer lies in the fact that because the schools were operated by either religious communities or by individual dioceses, many of those institutions, in fact, did apologize decades ago. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate, the OMIs, who ran a large number of residential schools, they apologized in 1991. I think they were among the first to apologize. So the issue is not what got us here so late, or in other words, what took us so long to get here, is that the process of apology, we have this image of an apology where it's done sort of once and then it's done, right? But in fact, the apology may have started, the process of apology started in 1991, but it brings us all the way now to 2022, precisely because you have all of these multiple entities, very, very different, who each religious community goes through its own process of discernment. Each diocese has to contend with it, and so you have the question becomes, okay, we have all of these individual apologies, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, to its credit, said and acknowledged these various individual apologies from Catholic entities, but it said the simple truth is that nobody noticed them. That this religious order or that religious order, says something that's very nice and a few people hear it, but it just doesn't penetrate the heart. When people look at a nun or a priest, they don't say, oh, Jesuit or Oblate or sister of whatever. They say Catholic Church. That's the association in their mind. And so they wanted to, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said, and I believe it said it not only for the good of the survivors, but for the good of the church. You'll be better off if you do something more collective than do something piecemeal. And the survivors will be better off if it happens that way as well. It'll be better for everybody. And so the question then becomes, who can speak for the church as a whole? Right? There's no Pope of Canada. There's only one Pope, and he's in Rome. And so this, led through a process of, okay, when does he come? How does he come? What does he say? And all that sort of thing. Within the Canadian church, I have been advocating in favor of an apology sooner rather than later. My own family, my mother is German. If there's a country that has had to reckon with its history, it's Germany. And I believe it's done so quite successfully, actually. And I learned a lot just growing up with that identity, and myself wondering, what does it mean to actually not just carry a Canadian passport, but a German one? And so to be able to know that apologies are not exercises in humiliation, they're exercises in humility. And humility is a good thing. And so let us work with that. And so I can't account for everybody else's mindset. Those are some of the reasons that went into why the process of apology was so stretched out. We're here now.
Well, so we're situated here now. In as you said, it's been like not just a momentum, but it's been bringing us to this point, right? Like time's linear. That's where we are now. So how do we make this not just a photo op? What are some of the concrete things that are being discussed by your brother bishops, by the Pope himself, about making this reality of walking together more concrete? Like, are there steps that are being proposed that can happen? Because this won't be the end, right? This can't be the end of it, done and dusted, because if not, then what's the point of sort of this exercise?
Well, exactly. And this is where I think as Catholics, we sometimes get tripped up on our own, you might say, unspoken assumptions about things like reconciliation. I mean, consider the word. We have a sacrament called the Sacrament of Reconciliation. And how does it work? Well, you acknowledge your sin. That's a good start, right? Examination of conscience. And then you go and you encounter a single individual who doesn't ask your name, has no idea who you are, may not even see your face if you're in a confessional. You get to say what you've done without having to go into tremendous detail. Even your act of contrition, your statement of remorse, can be somewhat formulaic. You get a penance, which often is very light compared to whatever the sin is that you did. Then you're absolved. And the absolution you get brings you back into communion with the church and opens the door to heaven, which frankly is a pretty good deal. And you have the promise that no one will ever say what you said, and it never has to be spoken of again. I mean, consider if that's our model of reconciliation, not just with God, but with everybody else. And of course, we're going to look at reconciliation as a one-shot deal and forget that exactly what you just said, there has to be an ongoing process afterwards. Now, I love confession, don't get me wrong, and I strongly encourage people to do it, because when we are burdened, when we are convicted in our heart, we have to confess it. We have to share it. We have to bring it forward to the Lord for that healing. But it's great to say I went to confession, but if there's another human being I need to confess to as well, like what did Jesus say? If you know your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift at the altar and go and reconcile with them. And then you can come back and bring your gift to the altar. And so that's the process that we're doing now. To be a more authentic Catholic Church, according to those words of Christ in the gospel, we need to reconcile with our brother or sister before we bring our gifts to the altar. I mean, we're going to keep saying Mass, don't get me wrong, but the idea is we cannot auto-declare ourselves reconciled. It's going to be part of a process. Now, concrete actions. The bishops of Canada have committed to a major fundraising campaign, and the board that will allocate the monies is composed of Indigenous peoples. The monies will be used for things that will help repair the damages from residential schools, such as, for example, loss of language, loss of culture. And so the members of the board are, one of the members of that board is a very faithful member of my diocese. And, I'm so proud that she's part of that. And so I have a tremendous confidence that this will be a very positive initiative. That's a structural question, but I think there are, very simple things that we can do. The custom in Canada of Indigenous gatherings, they're called powwows. So a powwow is it's a time of cultural celebration, dance, drumming, singing, food. It's a day or two to come together and celebrate. And powwows are by nature open to everybody. They're not just for the people of that tribe or nation or clan or what have you. Anybody can go. So I've made a point of going. And as I do that, I discover that some people in my diocese who've lived here their whole lives have never been to a powwow. So I would love for us, for example, to sponsor, I don't know, a bus or something to visit powwows, so that this feeling of the other is other can instead become, no, the other is us. We're not an us and them, we're an us, because in the church, that's what we're meant to be, right? We're meant to be a communion of us. And so promoting efforts at communion, which is not assimilation. In assimilation, you lose your distinctiveness. In communion, you keep it. It becomes a source of mutual enrichment. I think that's a contribution. It's a spiritual notion, but if we live it in little things with, love and trust, I think there are a lot of bridges that can be built. Personally, I'm new to the diocese. I've only been here a year and a half. And so I'm still learning. I'm still meeting people. But, I see myself personally as a bishop. I'm an ambassador for Jesus Christ. The apostle means person who is sent on a mission. That's what ambassadors are. And so I'm trying to build the bridges with all the people of our diocese, get to know the culture and the history. I've started to learn Ojibwe. 19 out of 20 First Nations in my diocese are Ojibwe. So I'm starting to try and learn the language, which is fascinating, by the way. I have to admit, I totally love it. It's awesome. Every language has a cultural mindset behind it, a new way to think, and it just expands your mind. It's incredible. So those are some of the small steps that we can do. But one thing I want to avoid, because you asked me the question, what can we do? One thing I want to avoid is a bunch of non-Indigenous people sitting around asking themselves, what can we do?
How can I speak for you?
Or how can I listen to you? Yeah. How can I figure out what you need and what is best for you? Like, hello, we're back at the starting point then,
Absolutely.
So, we got to build the bridges, bring the people together in trust, and then we're going to find the projects.
I guess it furthers my next question about the importance of the papal visit itself. Like, why wasn't April? I mean, it seems quite logical why it's more human, but why was it so important to have the Pope come and do this in person rather than have it in Rome? Like, what's the necessity of the human element of the Pope coming as a symbol?
Well, again, remember I said reconciliation is a process, right? So a gentleman by the name of Phil Fontaine, who was a senior leader among Indigenous people in Canada, he actually went to Rome in the time of Pope Benedict, and Pope Benedict offered words of regret and sorrow about the Indigenous, the residential schools experience. And I might add, some Catholic leaders at the time thought, okay, this is great, it's done. It's done. We've had the experience in the confessional, it's done. And in fact, it wasn't done. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came along and said, okay, yes, Phil Fontaine, he went to Rome, he met the Pope privately, there were no cameras, there was no recording of the meeting. All we have are people's testimonials of it. But how does that bring all of our people into the experience? To know that one guy went over there and had this meeting doesn't necessarily heal the heart of somebody who went to residential schools for 5 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said, we acknowledge the apologies of the different Catholic institutions. We acknowledge this positive encounter in Rome. now it's time to take this further so that the experience of reconciliation can be, sort of have greater range, have greater reach, and reach more people. And here's the thing: if you ask for that, and suppose somebody responds, you know what, I've apologized to you enough. That doesn't help reconciliation, because at a certain point we realize that it's the person who is injured who has the right to, they have the greater say in the question, And so the other important piece, I think, is that for Indigenous people in a special way, there's a strong connection to the land. In the spirituality and the mindset, there's a strong sense of this is our land, and there's a spirituality almost of the land. So to say we will send our people to your land so you can speak your words is very different from saying you will come to our land and be hosted by us. Where is the greater risk? Think about it. If you go to somebody's house, you risk them not opening the door. There's a risk of rejection. People going to Rome, the risk is on their end. Pope coming to Canada, the risk is on his.
Yeah,
and
there's
so
a vulnerability.
There's a greater courage, a greater demonstration, as you say, through vulnerability of humility. And so I think those are some of the reasons why it was very important.
Why through prayer? Why through participating in various ways in this? Is it important for not just Canadian Catholics, but Catholics around the world?
Well, it's a good question, but I think one of the things that I've heard Indigenous people say that has been a source of suffering has been not being listened to, or not being taken seriously. There have been experiences of racism within Canadian society and perpetrated by ordinary Canadians who themselves grew up with racist attitudes towards Indigenous, attitudes of superiority, attitudes of judgment, and that sort of thing. And so I believe what we're seeing is a hope that the actions of the hierarchy, such as a bishop, myself, or the Pope, it's not just going to be the people in Roman collars or in veils who are doing this, that our challenge is going to be to bring this back to our diocese, to our parish, to our communities, so that we can all have our eyes open. Because it's not reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not about reconciliation between Indigenous and the Church. It's between Indigenous and all of Canadian society, of which the churches are an important part. And the TRC recognized that some of the churches were actually real leaders in opening up this question within Canadian society itself. So there is an opportunity, an aspiration to see the churches take real leadership. But of course, who are we going to take the lead with if not our own people? And if we can, within our communities, show that this is a matter of concern for everyone, then it demonstrates, well, first of all, tremendous goodwill, but more than that, are we really believers in Jesus or not? Honestly, are we really going to take what he taught us seriously? And if so, is this consistent with what Jesus said and calls us to? And if so, then let's get on board. Let's walk with him.
What do you believe that the Canadian experience could help reveal to us or give to us in our own work towards reconciliation?
It's really hard for me to say because I don't know the Australian experience that much, and I prefer not to comment on things that I just, I have a basic rule: if I don't know what I'm talking about, I probably shouldn't say anything. But keeps me out of trouble sometimes. But what I do believe is that there are universal elements of this experience, not just vis-a-vis Indigenous people, but vis-a-vis the whole experience of reconciliation. And for us as Catholics, remember, like I said, we can be sort of formed or malformed by our experience, for example, of reconciliation, where we take the sacramental model and we think it applies to everything in as neat and tidy a manner. I mean, as neat and tidy as the sacrament itself can be. But, I remember somebody saying to me, I don't see why we should have to apologize a second time. I said, well, let's look at this. Suppose someone commits adultery against their spouse. They're on a business trip, they commit adultery. It's a one-time thing, feels terrible, comes home, confesses, very painful for the victim spouse, but they work through it and they're reconciled, but then discovers they have to go on another business trip with the same person. Do you tell your spouse or not? Does the husband tell his wife, yeah, the company's sending me on another business trip with the same person that I cheated on you with? Yeah, you better say it. And you know what? It might raise a lot of hurt feelings. Even though reconciliation really happens, it may raise a lot of hurt feelings again, and that's okay. And if you were to say, well, I don't see why you're so hurt. I already apologized to you, and I thought we put this behind us, then you're missing the point. There has to be an incarnation, a realistic incarnation in human experience of the beautiful elements of the spiritual teaching and practices that we have. All of that is great, but it's really the rubber's gotta meet the road. Yeah. Another example that I gave to someone who asked, why does it have to be the Pope speaking on behalf of everybody? What, he didn't do anything. He's from Argentina. He wasn't even around as a bishop when all this was going on. I was born in 1970. The residential schools in my diocese were already closed by the time I was even born. My parents hadn't even met when the schools closed. But I said, suppose you lend your keys to your son or daughter, keys to the car, and they go off and do something stupid and they damage a neighbor's property. Now you're going to tell your kid, go over there and apologize. But you know what? You'll probably also go over there and say, listen, I'm really sorry for what my son or daughter did. It's not the way I meant to raise them. And, I apologize for their behavior. It's not personal responsibility, but there's an acknowledgement that because we are in solidarity with each other as one family, sometimes we do have to speak for another because our neighbor might be wondering where we stand. Mm-hmm. And so those are reflections that help us to have a more incarnate understanding of the beautiful theological principles that we have in our church around things like reconciliation and truth-telling and communion and so on. And that, I think, is perhaps the real opportunity and the real challenge we're facing now. I hope that makes sense.
That makes total sense. That makes total sense. And I want to thank you for your time. But just before you go, people can follow you for some resources, I assume. You have a Twitter account that you might want to mention for people to follow during the visit?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I do not do dances on TikTok, but
thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Yeah, but no, and just my name, Thomas Dowd. I have a website, thomasdowd.ca. So that's DOWD. So thomasdowd.ca. And I believe I have a subpage in there. I haven't written a lot in it lately because being a bishop turns out is very busy. But I do post more on social media, and so there should be social media links available there.
Well, again, thanks for joining us on Common Home TV.
Thank you.